So this event is sponsored by the SBU Initiative for Individuals with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. This is the 10th year of the initiative, and we sponsor talks throughout the year, usually 1 or 2 fall and winter, and then Voices of Autism in the spring. We're very excited to have you here, and we're excited to have our guest speaker. Get my top out here. Dr. Allison D completed her PhD in the School of Psychology at the University of Washington. She's a licensed clinical psychologist with extensive experience working with individuals with neurodevelopmental disabilities and related medical conditions. Her training and experiences in school and clinical psychology, I think, uniquely prepares her for working with families and individuals on the spectrum in particular. We all know the importance of families and schools for positive development for anybody, right? But especially for individuals with disabilities, it's really important to have those systems talking to each other. And that as parents, we understand how to negotiate the educational system, because it can be a different experience for parents. And so we're really excited to have Allison here to talk about that. Today she's going to share with us her 32 years of clinical experience, and she's going to try to answer or tell us why you are your child's most important educational advocate. Notes to parents and children.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I developed my talk for not just parents, but also for educators and clinicians, because I heard that there would be more than that in addition to parents being here, we'd have audience members who are also educators, clinicians, and students today. So I have some information that I hope will address everybody in the room. And one of my most important, to me, messages to all of you is how critical coordination of care is, and how important it is for families and educators and clinicians to speak to one another and find common language and find common ground. And so I hope that as you're reading slides and hearing information that's targeted at families, and you're a clinical provider or an educator, that you'll be thinking about the family and the parent perspective there. So I am going to speak about all my different kinds of experiences. My formal clinical experience didn't start 32 years ago, because I was a high school junior at the time, 32 years ago. And so for those of you trying to do the math, that makes me just shy of half a century, as my children love to point out to me. And in and so I'll talk a little bit about that. All right. You know where I need to point the pointer to make it change? All right, I can do that. All right. So today, the learning objectives for this talk are effective advocacy for students with autism, basics of special education law, transitions to anticipate and prepare for, and collaboration and coordination of care. In an hour and a half, or an hour plus extra for question and answer, you know I'm not going to get real into detail about any one of those topics. So what I was really hoping to do was to share information that I have found most valuable in my practice over time. And as we go, I'll tell you a little bit more about what my practice is now, what that looks like. But I want to talk to you first about what got me into this field in the first place, and what got me interested in autism in the first place. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about 3 of the first children with autism that I met and worked with in my life. And the first one was Sabrina in 1987. All right, Sabrina was a 14-year-old girl who had autism. She was living in her family's home, and she was being educated in her family's home, because at that time, Her mother told me that she couldn't be educated in the public school system. They weren't prepared to have a student like Sabrina. Sabrina didn't speak, she was nonverbal, and we didn't know a whole lot about autism at the time. In fact, in 1987, autism was not yet a disability under the special education law. Okay. So we didn't have a lot of specialized awareness or treatment. There weren't really treatment manuals yet to help. There weren't ABA resources online to look at. So I showed up at Sabrina's house. Somebody handed me a paperback book that a parent wrote in the late 70s and said, we're going to do intervention for this girl. And that intervention looks like this. Do what she does. Follow her lead. If she's on the floor rocking, you're on the floor rocking. Right? Sabrina's father was deployed. And it was a military family, and he was deployed. So Sabrina's mother was single parenting Sabrina and her siblings. And Sabrina loved it when we would get down on the floor next to her and we would do things that she wanted us to do. And one of the things that she loved is she would take my hand and she would put it on her forearm, and she wanted me to stroke her forearm like this. And that would make her so happy. One day, my teacher, my biology teacher, who had gotten me connected to Sabrina's family, met me at the house and said, it's amazing, she can read. And he had brought index cards that had different names and different words on it. And he had written his name, Jean, and another spelling of another name, Jean, on it, and taught her the difference. And then she could tell the difference. And it was my first experience of learning about how much is inside somebody that they may not be able to tell us, and how communication disorders could really get in the way of that. That was a really important experience for me, and a really formative experience for me. The lessons I learned from that are follow the lead of the child. There's wisdom in watching and wisdom in waiting. The right to a free and appropriate education is sacred. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was, as part of my educational program, going into the home of another teenage girl in my hometown and working with her because she wasn't being served and couldn't be served by her public school system. That was also where people started to say to me, you've worked with someone with autism, so you can do this, right? That meant work with anybody with any diagnosed disability in any of the contexts that I work in, like music camp, for example. And what we learn when we enter people's homes has great value. And what I find now in working in the clinical world and in the education world is we rarely go into people's homes. And there's a lot of value in seeing what happens there. I don't know if anybody saw the recent headlines in the Seattle Times about programs in other states where educators go into homes and how that can work, not just for students with disabilities, but for any student. But that became one of the foundational pieces of my later practice, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a while. So next is Hannah. After I went to college, continued working with people with autism in every context I could, and in every context I could find, which generally meant volunteering. I got an internship at the Exceptional Children with Communication and Interaction Disorders program in Minnesota. And there I met Hannah, and I worked with Hannah. She was a 3-year-old girl, and she had some kind of social communication disorder, and people weren't quite sure what. And I was an eager college student, and excited about the process of diagnosing. And I became convinced that Hannah had Rett syndrome, which at the time fell under the umbrella of autism. And I collected all the information that I could, everything that she did, that to me confirmed that she had the diagnosis of Rett syndrome, that she had Rett syndrome. She didn't have Rett syndrome. Confirmation bias is real. Confirmation bias is when we make a decision about something and then we gather and pay attention to only information that confirms that belief that we already have. I'm glad I learned that lesson early on, because as a clinician who diagnoses, it comes up for me all the time. And I work with families and school providers and other clinicians who have decided prior to a diagnostic evaluation that a child has a specific diagnosis. And sometimes my job is to say, let's put the brakes on, because there's other information that's not matching, and we've got to expand our field of vision to both. So Hannah taught me, don't believe everything you think. We endanger others when we look for information to confirm a belief that we already have. And it's important for all of us to remember that, and not just in the context of this. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead to 1994. I've finished college. I taught preschool in an inclusive preschool in Minnesota for kids with autism and trauma backgrounds, and I moved to Washington, and I got a job as a paraeducator in a high school for a girl who had autism. I didn't know paraeducators existed because the last high school girl with autism I worked with, I was in her home. This one was in school. She had threatened to stab her assistant principal with a pencil when she got mad at her. So they decided to hire a one-to-one paraeducator, and that was me. And they said, "You've worked with kids with autism, right? You got this." That was most of my training, right? So the reason there's a picture of a remote control up here is one day I walked into class with this student, with Ruth, and she handed me a painting of a remote control. And I said, "Tell me about this." And she said, "That's me." The assignment for the class had been to do a self-portrait. And she said, "I'm remote and I like to be in control." And I thought, well, if that's not a good analogy for her specific version of autism, how it felt for her, nothing was. That young woman taught me a whole lot of different things. She also kept me on my toes, and one of the most important messages that she taught me was, don't take it personally. Because I would have great days with her and I would feel like everything was super, and then she would have a hard day and I would sometimes catch the brunt of it, and I had to learn quickly it wasn't about me, and don't take it personally. And that's a really important one, and one that I'm constantly talking about, a lesson I'm constantly telling families and educators and clinicians. Don't take it personally, and it's not about you. If you behave in that way, you won't move forward. And to move forward, you've got to be able to be graceful. All right, training is important. Hannah, or Ruth, gave me a lot of on-site training while I was with her. So you might be surprised who teaches you. All right. I went on a field trip last week with one of my son's classes, and assigned to my group was a fourth grader, and she was accompanied by a one-to-one paraeducator. So I started talking to this paraeducator, and I learned that she actually had graduated from SPU in a completely unrelated field, and she was working as a one-to-one paraeducator with students who had significant behavioral disabilities. And she said to me, "I love my job. I wake up every morning and I am so excited and so happy that I get to go to work." And that felt profound to me, and it brought me back to that experience that I had back in 1994. And it reminded me that when we're looking at people's credentials, her credentials wouldn't have told us that she would be the right person for this student. But the space that she gave this young woman, and the joy and the respect that she regarded her with through the whole day of this field trip was remarkable. And I was learning from her as we went. All right. That experience of constantly learning from people, other people who are doing jobs you did 25 years ago, was a good reminder for me, especially walking into this talk. In 2005, I was hired to be the director of a new clinic, the University of Washington Autism Center, that had opened up on the university, on the UW-Tacoma campus. And I thought, really? Me? What the heck? And I have a picture of the state capitol here because I got to stand right next to Christine Gregoire. She signed a bill about autism. And my qualifications were, you've worked with someone with autism, you can do this, right? I mean, by then I had some letters after my name. I had a lot of good experience. But it was pretty scary to me. That phase of my work were some of the first times that I was sitting at tables with parents and attorneys and other clinicians and having everybody look at me to tell them about a diagnostic evaluation, or standing in front of a room full of people and talking about things like today, or sitting in a room with a parent and holding their hand as I gave them difficult news, right? So many opportunities for me to think, what am I doing here? And what I learned along the way is, I will actually say the first time I had one of those meetings with attorneys and we were all sitting in the tiny little preschool chairs. Anybody ever sit in a preschool chair at a meeting? And yep. I had to stop at a store on my way back to work to buy a new shirt because I was so anxious about it. Because I thought everybody in that room knew more than me, and they were going to find out during that meeting that that was the truth. So now I get to do a lot of training with graduate students, people in training to be clinicians, to be providers, and sometimes working with families in homes to do training. And one of the things that I've learned over time is that you belong here. We belong here. Everybody belongs here. At some point, all of us feel like imposters. Anybody ever heard the term imposter syndrome? Right? Anybody ever felt imposter syndrome before? I hear from parents a lot. I walk into those school meetings and there's all those people at the table, and I just know they're not going to listen to what I have to say, or I just feel like I don't know what I'm talking about, and they hand me that booklet with 8-point font that has all of the rules and rights, and I'm supposed to know all of that stuff, right? Thank you. That was supposed to be.
That is a worthless document. And it uses so many trees to print out. For some reason.
This is the belief that we have when we experience imposter syndrome, right? I know that I only know a little bit, and I think everybody else knows a lot. But what really is happening is I know this bit, and you know this bit, and that attorney knows this bit, and that other parent knows this bit, and the speech language pathologist knows this bit. And we work really well together when we bring all of our bits together, and nobody tries to know everybody else's bit. And that's a piece of what I wanted to talk to you about today. Many of the suggestions and recommendations that I'll give you today are ones that I've failed to follow at one time or another, or learned the hard way. Over the course of my career, there are statements that I've made to families that I wish I could take back. Times when I offered sympathy when I wish I had offered celebration instead, or empathy instead. I'm grateful to all of the people who have taught me along the way and keep teaching me along the way. Most of all, the families that allow me to work with them and their children, and the educators and other clinicians who educate me as we go. All right, so the last bit of fast forwarding I'll do is 12 years ago, my business partner and I started the Brooks Powers Group. And when we were first hatching this idea, we wanted to start it because we were frustrated with the kinds of services that were available to people in our community. My business partner was working at Children's Hospital in the inpatient psych unit, and I was working at the Autism Center. And we felt constrained by the models of consultation and support that we could give to other people. We couldn't go into homes and give support like we wanted to. We couldn't stay in schools for long periods of time and support them. And we wanted to do things our way, but we weren't sure it could happen. So we sought some consultation from other people in the field and some of our professors. And one of them, who we had and still have tremendous respect for, said, if that was a viable model, somebody else would have done it by now. And so we took that information and we went ahead and did it anyway. 12 12 years later, we have 25 people, and we're trying really hard to not grow anymore. But it turns out that the model was there. I have sat in a lot of meetings with people when providers or educators have said to them, we just don't have that here, or we can't offer that here. And we don't have that here is not an acceptable justification for not providing services that are necessary, right? We can't have exactly what we want, but we can't not have appropriate services for kids just because it doesn't exist yet. All right, so I'm gonna move into advocacy as a parent. I thought somebody would go, aw, because it's a really cute picture. Thank you, appreciate that. All right, so I came into parenthood long after I began my professional career, and I'm still astounded when I look back and think about all of the parents who let me work with their kids and trusted the information that came out of my mouth, even though I wasn't a parent myself. But then I remember that that ball of circles, right? And my circle didn't have to be knowing what it's like from the inside, but to be able to listen to what it's like when a parent tells me what it's like there, and then to bring my expertise to the table too. I have learned clearly as a parent that I need to seek the expertise of people in their bubbles as much as possible, and even when it's unpleasant. So this year I had one of my children had some really rough experiences at school, and it got my blood boiling. I was super duper upset, and I could think of only one course of action, and it wasn't legal. So but I was Mama Bear, right? And I did not know what to do. And I went to school, and I got to sit down with the school counselor at my child's school. And he heard what I had to say through my gnashing teeth and my growling and some tears. And then he said, "I'm so sorry. That isn't okay. Here's what I'd like to do. Is that okay with you?" And it's amazing how that worked, right? I looked back and I thought, why did that change happen so quickly? He heard me and he validated me, but he also started, when I walked into his office, he said, "I just want to tell you how much I love your kids. I see so-and-so every week at student council meetings, and I think he's terrific." And that, knowing that he was connected to my child and that he knew my child and that he had something positive to say about my child, made me relax and made me trust him, and that he had both of our backs as we moved forward. Also saved me from legal involvement, so I wouldn't have gone there. All right, so advocacy as a parent with schools. So there are key things that parents can and should advocate for in schools for their children with neurodiversity, and really for all children. And inclusion, I think, is one of the most important. I'll talk about law in a little bit, but we have a legal standard of least restrictive environment, and part of what that means is we should have people included with other people as much as possible. I lacked the opportunity to have inclusion in education when I was going through elementary school and middle school and high school. I didn't know of or see students with autism, and if I hadn't had the opportunity to get connected to United Way and go meet Sabrina, I might never have started down this path. That's what I missed out on, in addition to a whole lot else. And inclusion to me is not just about what people with neurodiversity miss out on, but what everybody misses out on when we don't have access to the whole range of that diversity. Parents should advocate for staff who have training or get training in autism, for IEP goals that include social, communication, and independence. When I was doing a dive into the research on consultation and autism for this talk, one of the things that I learned was that it's surprising how many people with autism spectrum disorders don't have social and communication goals in their IEPs, even though that's one of the core pieces of autism, core diagnostic features of autism spectrum disorders. Parents also should ask for and demand staff who collaborate with them and with other providers, and for positive behavior interventions and supports, and for transition plans. And we'll talk about each of those as we move forward here. So I had an email pop up in my email this week, and it was a link to this article. The Understood website is one of the websites out there that has great information on advocacy, and they have 10 defusing phrases for parents to use at IEP meetings. And the first one is, I may be misunderstanding. And I loved that that resource was out there because I get involved in a lot of situations where there's high conflict. And by showing you that slide, I don't mean to imply that it's the responsibility of the parent to make sure that everybody stays calm in a meeting. It's not your responsibility. But there are still things that you can do to help make sure it goes that way, and that the mama bear that's in the aggressive stance doesn't derail the meetings necessarily. All right. So as a parent, it's important to know that connection matters. Connection, like I talked about with the school counselor, ask for it for your own child, and then model it yourself by starting with your child's teachers and staff. Because when you connect with a teacher, that teacher is more likely to make sure your child has the accommodations that are in their IEP, or more likely to identify places where modifications could happen, or more likely to give you a call when things go poorly, and you're more likely to trust what they say. So connection matters, and modeling it yourself with teachers is really important. And then the second one, it's hard to read here, says you may have more common ground with the people at the table than you expect. It's been amazing to me to learn how many clinicians and how many special education administrators have children who are neurodiverse themselves. Huge number of them. So oftentimes when we're sitting at a table and we're not agreeing on what should happen, or somebody has decided what they think should happen and they've closed off other information because they've got that confirmation bias going on, it's really important to let people speak from their own positions of information and knowledge. It's often not about the money. There are pots of funding. Funding is kind of dismal, as you know about, for education and special education. But there are pots of money and ways to access services that school districts often have access to. And I've seen so many times teams choose the hard way, choose not to access that source of funding and hand the child over to somebody else because they don't believe it's right for them. And oftentimes parents don't have access to knowing kind of where that's coming from. But if the assumption is that it's because of money, it makes it really hard to move forward in conversations. Sometimes it is. And sometimes things don't work out. And sometimes you have to go with other options. So I said before, start with conversation rather than confrontation. But if it doesn't work, there are other resources. Key strategies to know your rights and your child's rights, and I can't tell you what all of those are now. I'll go into some basics in a minute. Bring someone with you to meetings. It helps just to have somebody there, even if they know nothing about any of the things that are relevant there. If they know you, they have their own circle to bring to the bubble. Be the bear your child needs when they need it, right? Sometimes you gotta let the claws out, but if you let them out too early, they can prevent you from making other pathways that would be helpful, and allow others to join their expertise with yours. All right. So, what to ask for from clinical providers? As a clinical provider, I want you to demand that I hear you and that I value what you say and that I trust that you are the person that knows your child best, right? I want you to demand that I will tell you if I don't have expertise in this. I won't just fake it. And I will ask for consultation from other people if I need it. One of the things that I'm always telling the trainees that come and work with us, even if after they've got PhDs and people are calling them doctor, if I don't hear you asking other people questions and checking and consulting, I'm going to have a lot less faith in your abilities as a provider. Asking questions is a sign of strength. Just like we often tell kids getting help and asking for help is a sign of strength, it's true for clinical providers too. And you should demand that I will value the best interest of your child above you liking me. That's a hard one for a lot of clinicians. We like it when you like us. We like it a lot. We do not like making people unhappy. We want what's best for your child. You want what's best for your child. And sometimes we're going to have different ideas of what that means. But you need to be able to rely on me to tell you if I think that what you want or what you're asking for or what you believe isn't what's best for your child. And you have to demand that of your providers. We learn how to be uncomfortable. It's one of our topics in grad school, right, Bev? Right? It's okay. All right. So also you can ask that your clinician will give you hard news when it's necessary, but that they'll deliver it with compassion, that your clinician will speak directly with other providers and not ask you to be the telephone. I've seen so many situations get way yuckier and messier and uglier and kids not getting served as they should because people didn't talk directly to each other. My kids like watching Ellen's Game of Games. Anybody see that show before? They do a telephone game during that show where they shout messages and people are wearing headphones and nothing ever ends up as the same original message. People need to talk directly to one another, not because people are trustworthy, but because I'm interpreting information that you give me with a psychologist lens, and a parent's interpreting information that you give them from a parent lens, and a teacher is interpreting it from a teacher lens. We need to be able to hear it from each other without the interpretation mediary. I want you to encourage or to make sure I give you space to ask questions, and that I'll actively check to say, does what I'm saying to you about your child match with your experience of your child? And that your clinician will start with your child's strengths and will return to strengths time after time. I was sitting with a parent recently, and she was having to do an assignment from her child's program, a program that her child was in, and it was about writing down what her child's strengths and weaknesses were. And every single strength she wrote down was also a weakness, like perseverance and won't let things go, right? Lack of flexibility and single-minded focus on a goal until that goal is achieved. Often our greatest strengths are often our greatest weaknesses, and it just depends on what we do with it. We got to go back to strengths all the time. So strength-based evaluations and strength-based resources is really important. All right, as a clinician, what can you advocate for? You can advocate for your client's best interests above the adoration of your client's parents, right? You will get yourself more and better information if things are unclear or if you're not sure. That if you just ran out of time to do more testing but you're not sure about the diagnosis, but you got to go with something, so you're going to flip a coin, not okay. You got to make that space to get more information. Demand access to other providers serving the child so that you know what's happening there. And demand that children and their families are valued and respected among all of the people that you are connecting with. And help and support coordination of care. Finally, use evidence-based practice in all settings as much as possible. I always think back to that sitting on the floor with Sabrina when I read about evidence-based practice, and we didn't have any evidence-based practice at that time, but we had a book, so, and it was a starting place. All right, so advocacy as an educational provider. Key things to advocate for are your student's best interest, what your student is entitled to, not just what's available to them, access to more and different information. A lot of the work that we do in the group that I run now is consulting with teachers, and sometimes that pathway is a teacher demanding that somebody help provide them with training or information so that they know what to do. Access to the other providers, that keeps coming up, right? I want people to talk directly to one another as much as possible. And partnering with parents. It's really hard to have access to parents when the kids are getting on the bus and people are at work at different hours. But that connection is really critical. And then teachers can demand that they have the opportunity to use evidence-based practices as well. Ask for an opportunity to develop relationships. Over and over, this was one of the things that surprised me early on in kids with autism who often seemed like they didn't really want to connect with other people. One of the most critical make or break pieces of their educational program was relationships and whether their teachers or other people could connect with them. And that make or break piece was really, really important. We also have research evidence that the relationship building not only increases academic engagement for children, so if we're thinking about children who have behavior problems in school, 1 minute of relationship building with a teacher can result in 8 minutes of academic engagement that wouldn't otherwise have happened. But also we find that when teachers devote time to relationship, that their own stress levels go down and their well-being goes up. Emotional exhaustion goes down and well-being goes up. That's pretty powerful because oftentimes teachers are feeling like they don't have the space and the time to build those relationships, but boy, does it pay off. All right, so special education law is next. Some basics of special education. All children are entitled to an education that's specifically designed to meet their unique needs, and all children are entitled to an appropriate education at no cost to the individual, right? That seems really clear. And then it starts getting complicated, right? We have an alphabet soup of acronyms in education. IEPs, IEEs, FBAs, BIPs, PBIS, ABC, antecedent behavior consequence charts, FAPE, LRE, right? There are so many acronyms, and those of us who work and live in worlds where we use those acronyms a lot sometimes forget what it's like to not know what FBA means or not know what FAPE means. So make sure that people slow down and tell you if they start getting ahead of you in that. All right, so based on the Individual with Disabilities Education Act that was first enacted in 1975, this was designed to protect students who had disabilities in the education system. Every child is entitled to a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. Right? Every child is entitled to a comprehensive evaluation of their needs, and every child who qualifies is entitled to have a written plan that specifies how their needs will be met, and that has to be revised at least yearly, but can be revised any time during a year. You don't just get one a year. You can request an IEP meeting as many times as you want to, and a lot of parents don't know that. And your IEP has to include measurable annual goals. Note that appropriate, that free and appropriate education does not mean the best education. That's not the standard. So what does appropriate mean? We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute here. But oftentimes families start hitting roadblocks when they use the word best and when they're asking for things for their children. So that's an important key word to remember and think about is appropriate. All right, so there's room for interpretation in the law, just like there is in all law. It specifies processes more than specifics. districts have to follow rules and procedures, but how that's interpreted, just like ethical codes and just like legal codes, there's room for interpretation, which also means there's room for disagreement and sometimes anger, but there's also room for creativity. All right. So part of what I mentioned there was every child is entitled to a comprehensive evaluation. So in order to qualify or be deemed eligible for special education services, children have the right to an initial evaluation and then subsequent evaluation that has to happen at least every 3 years and not more than every year. So you can request an evaluation after it's been a year, but before that 3-year time limit is up. Whether you are entitled to get it before that 3-year time limit is up depends a little bit on interpretation and probably depends a little bit on relationship. Probably depends a little bit on which bear is used at which time and how well that matches the situation. And if you're not satisfied with that initial evaluation, you can ask for more. And that more can happen within the district, or sometimes it's delivered by providers outside of the district if there's not somebody in the district that's qualified to meet that need of that evaluation. All right. So eligibility for special education services depends on 2 things, both the presence of a disability that's specified in the law, and remember in 1987, autism was not yet on that list, and evidence that that disability causes an adverse educational impact. And the second part of that's really critical, because families will often say, my kid needs an IEP, they have a diagnosis of autism, but unless there's a demonstrated adverse educational impact, you might not access it. And note that educational is a much broader term than academic, because what happens in our educational systems is not just academics. We don't prepare people for life if we're just focusing on their reading and writing and math in Washington State history, right? We're preparing them for life in a much larger way. So that's an important key to remember as you're advocating for your child is if somebody keeps trying to railroad you into saying there's no adverse academic impact, but there is an adverse social impact or an adverse behavioral impact, that's a really important piece to bring up and push for. Okay. All right, so IEPs specify placement, where somebody spends their time, where the program is located, what the program looks like, and then related services. There are so many pieces of IEPs to know about and to think about. One of the things that's really important to think about refers to some of that clinician-based information I said before is you should always ask for the IEP to be strengths-based. When we're talking about disability, when we're finding out whether somebody qualifies because of adversity of some kind, we can get ourselves down a path of only talking about things that are going poorly and things that are going wrong. And that can lead us in unfortunate directions. We can miss things when we forget to focus on the strengths and what should happen next. This is a PDF that's from that same website I mentioned earlier, Understood. They have some resources there. It's not a resource that's designed for people with autism spectrum disorders. It targets more learning disabilities and ADHD, but they have some great information on there anyway. All right, so related services can include SLP and audiology services, OT, psychological services, recreation, social work, counseling. There are all kinds of related services, and none of these are academic, right? So, but those all can be part of that educational plan. IEPs and 504 plans also include accommodations. Sometimes we talk about accommodations as alternatives to frustration. Accommodations are things adults do to change the setting and how things are going for a child. Right? So I also work in the field of fetal alcohol syndrome, and this quote comes from that field. If you've told the child 1,000 times and he still doesn't understand, then it's not the child who's a slow learner. It's possible. Earlier today I said to one of my children, how many times do I have to tell you? Put the toilet seat down. Yes, I can be a slow learner at times. But accommodations are an important part of 504 plans and IEPs. And oftentimes people will have IEPs that have lots and lots of accommodations on them, but a child may not necessarily be receiving them. All right. So educational benefit. In order to be appropriate, a district has to provide some educational benefit. There was a very recent 2017 court case in front of the Supreme Court. There was a ruling on what that means. What does appropriate mean? And they decided that the definition needs to be, or that appropriate means appropriately ambitious. That children be served to the maximum extent possible, and that children be served equally. Okay. So there are standards, even though there's a lot of ambiguity about what it means to get services, special education services, there are standards. So pulling that one out appropriately, thank you, appropriately ambitious could be a good one to interject into an IEP meeting if you're feeling like that's not happening for your student. All right. Moving on to one of our other targets, transitions. Change is hard. Change is hard for almost all of us. Change is also usually where amazing things happen, right? We know that transitions in general are typically difficult for people with autism spectrum disorders. Transitions just from home to school, or from a non-preferred activity to a preferred activity, or a preferred activity to a non-preferred activity. There's so many transitions in our days, and there are even bigger transitions throughout lives at school. When we talk about transitions in the educational advocacy context, that usually makes people think about transitions to adulthood. I was so thrilled to see some of the services that were out there in the lobby. We're getting more and more resources now available to people with neurodiversity now in all kinds of contexts, and I'm really so happy about it. But there are other transitions in the lives of children that are also important to plan for and to think about. So birth to 3 to pre-kindergarten, pre-kindergarten to kindergarten, kindergarten to elementary, elementary to middle school to high school, post-high school, and to adulthood. Some of the most amazing transition leaps, some of the most amazing developmental leaps that I've seen people I've worked with make have come when they've hit their mid-20s, and their prefrontal cortex kind of hits this period of explosive development that their peers were experiencing at 18 when they were being graduated from college and high school. So if you've got people who still have years of prefrontal cortex growth to go, don't lose hope. There's amazing things that can happen then. Transitions can be very vulnerable places for our children and for students with autism. I've heard so many stories from families about services disappearing at transitions. Oh, your child is moving on to middle school, they've met all their IEP goals, I think that we can probably pull these services or pull this support, or they don't really do OT at the middle school level, so we're not gonna give that resource now. All of them, all transitions, are time for more supports for people with autism spectrum disorders, not for fewer or for less support. Education's exciting. We get to take brains that are developing and changing all the time, and we get to have some influence on what happens with them. There's an amazing thing that happens during the whole elementary school period through middle school and into the high school period, and it's brain pruning. So this is a little hard to read, but this is a picture of a baby, and there is a slide, microscopic picture, or a picture of a microscopic slide of neurons. we have an amazing amount of neurons when we're babies, but there's not a whole lot of neurons there. If we pull a little tiny slice of brain out and look at it for a 6-year-old, it's packed with neurons. Boy, between birth and 6 years old, the number of neurons we're packing into that skull is really, really amazing. And then at 14, we've lost a few of them, right? Yikes. That's okay, it's supposed to happen, because we got rid of ones that we didn't need and kept ones that we did. And then we hit 40 and we start losing the ones we need and keeping the ones that well, what we're doing is we're adding material to our base, and then we get to start chipping away at it. So think of educators and people who work with children and parents as sculptors. They're helping with that process of pruning out what's not needed so that what we're left with is something incredible and beautiful. Transitions bring these questions. Parents come to me with these questions. Should we start now, or should we wait another year before we put our kid into school? Should we move forward, or should we hold our kid back for another year? Boy, are you going to run into challenges if you want to hold your child back a grade in our educational system here. Should we stay at the school, or should we change school? Should I start homeschooling my kid because their needs aren't being met? Should we switch from public to private? Should we switch from private to public? And will my child live with me forever? These are decisions and questions, and the answer changes depending on your situation, your child's situation, and what's out there. But getting support in those transitions is really important. I often feel like I'm being asked to consult a crystal ball. The message here is, don't ask me, I'm a ball. What should I do? How will it turn out? But what we all can do when we bring our circles together is figure things out a little bit more. This one says, young man, go to your room and stay there until your cerebral cortex matures. Also not a very viable option, unfortunately. So we can do a lot to help with that transition piece of things. So I guess I would say my take-home message from that earlier stuff is don't lose services at those transitions. That's an important time to keep them. And when we're thinking about transition services, we do have very specific federal law about requirements for transition services. The IDEA 2004 definition of transition services is that transition means a designated set of activities for a child with a disability that's designed with a results-oriented process, is based on the child's individual needs, and takes into account strengths and preferences and interests, and includes instruction, related services, community experience, development of employment opportunities, post-school adult living objectives, right? I don't see academic there much at all, because that's what we're preparing for life. Transition plans have to be included in IEPs no later than when the IEP is the IEP that's in effect when the child is 16, and it's based on where at the time that you're writing the plan you think that a child will go after high school. It changes. It's okay if you write a transition plan for employment or for college and then somebody changes their mind. That's not a problem. These plans can be changed anytime. But it needs to include appropriate measurable goals based on assessments, and services must be listed that will help the child reach those goals. So there's a whole separate assessment process in transition, and information that you gather includes interests, functional skills, aptitudes and skills like mechanical skills, healthcare needs, learning styles, all kinds of things that all goes into the transition assessment. It's pretty comprehensive. It's not just handing somebody a piece of paper that asks what their career goals are and then developing a program based on that. So if if that's how transition planning happens for your student, you can demand and ask for more. Here's some alphabet letters that go together that are really important to know for transition. DDA. Sometimes I'm surprised to find families who aren't connected to or receiving services through DDA for students with autism. Over the course of my work as a psychologist in this state, we've had more limited availability of resources in DDA. It used to be that your IQ could be anywhere. If you had a diagnosis of autism and challenges with adaptive skills, you would qualify. Now there's an IQ cutoff for qualify for DDA after you're 9 years old. DVR, the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, is a very important resource for people to access. And Supplemental Security Association, sources of funding that can support people into adulthood. All right, so next we get to collaboration and coordination of care. You might have noticed that I have been talking about collaboration and coordination of care all along, because I believe that it's a really critical piece of what makes life and intervention and support successful for people with autism spectrum disorders. So when we think about neurology, we often have families come to me and say, I think my child's left-brained, or I think my child's right-brained, and can you tell me more about how they learn or what they're like as a learner? And what we're finding more and more with brain research over time is that lateralization is less important than the connections between all of the parts of the brain, right? So I'm going to say similarly, more important, just like the sides of the brain are less important than how the connections are made over time. Which side of the table you're sitting on is less important than how well the people who are at that table are connecting with each other, right? It's way more important and way more critical. I referred to this in this slide as a circle of competence. Right? We all have our areas of competence and our areas of expertise, and connecting those to other people's at the same table is what makes our interventions and our plans so much more powerful. So research tells us that effective strategies, we're sort of constantly doing research studies on what works with kids, and our research studies always go so well when we get to do our tests and our comparisons in a lab setting or in a quiet clinic setting. But when we're going out to the schools, there's a lot of variables that we don't get to control that can kind of make or break the situation, right? And one of the interesting pieces of research that I read, this came from a study from 2012, is that the school context in which inclusion programming occurs is actually more important than the specific procedures that are used to try to make inclusion happen. And that's one of the big messages and one of the big challenges in advocating for inclusion today, is that inclusion happens best when we're redefining and remodeling the whole system, not when we're bringing somebody into a system that's made for people who mostly follow the same way of learning and mostly interact with people in the same way, and then giving them the support of a student who worked with a kid with autism once so they know what to do right to help them with inclusion in the classroom. It's not a very powerful inclusion program unless that person that's doing that helping has that joy and that respect, and the rest of the setting is available to support those goals as well. So it's a really sticky process, and one that I'm running into a lot in my work is, how can we do inclusion better and better? And we're often fighting with people who really are of the same mind as us about inclusion, that we want
more of it, that we believe in it, that we think it's really powerful, and that when we try to get it by just changing one bit of the circle, we really don't make very much progress. So I don't think usually people who are parenting children with autism or teaching and working in school and in special education or providing services have a whole lot of time to go down to the state capitol and do lots of lobbying for things. Unfortunately, that's often the way things happen. I talked a little bit before about how I started, I got to go down to the state capitol for signing of a bill for autism. And I started in the field of fetal alcohol syndrome at a similar time. And what I've seen happen in autism with access to funding and access to information has been phenomenal. And part of that is because we have legislators who will stand on the floor, on the Senate floor, and say, my child has autism or my grandchild has autism, and this is important to me. So getting voices heard is really important, and having advocates out there is really important. Collaborative consultation results in better IEPs. So consultation, the way that Tom, my business partner, and I really wanted to be able to deliver it when we were working in other settings that didn't allow us to go into homes or to stay in schools for longer periods of time. What we know that now, what research tells us is that works, and it works. It gives us better IEP goals. It gives us better outcomes for children. So demand consultation when you can for your student. Demand that teachers who don't have training get training. Don't demand that your child only be served by somebody who is already an autism expert, because the person after you coming into the school psychologist's office is demanding that they be a twice exceptional expert or a learning disabilities expert, or wondering why they don't know anything about dysgraphia or dyscalculia or those kinds of things. We can't expect one person to be that expert on everybody, so don't force that role on somebody, but you can demand that they get access to people who do know and do have the information that they need. And then research indicates that when we incorporate specific motivational features just into the work itself for students with autism, we see huge impacts on their functioning in classrooms. So when we do things like say, would you like to work on your math homework over here or over here? Would you like to earn a gummy or time on extra time at recess? When we're handing somebody work to do, they actually do a lot better, and they don't necessarily need another person right next to them making sure their behavior stays in control when they're asked to do things the exact same way that everybody else is. So those kinds of little changes can be really, really powerful. And you can ask for them, and you can say that they're evidence-based, because I told you should ask for evidence-based practices, right? All right. Collaboration counts. Teachers should possess skills to work with parents and to be able to talk to other providers, and other providers should be able to act as professional supports for teachers. I meet a lot of psychologists who don't know much about special education and special education law, and a lot of teachers who don't know much about clinical information, and we need bridges. And we can start by dropping acronyms and letters and using the common language that we do have. But that kind of information, that kind of collaboration also is an evidence-based practice that results in really important and positive outcomes for people. This is key strategies for caregivers and advocates. It says, gather all the available information that describes your child's disabilities, needs, and strengths. Knowledge is power. People who are prepared make better decisions. Put everything in writing. I have met some really amazing people over time, and one of them is a parent who became an educational advocate, consults and accompanies families to IEP meetings all the time. She demands everything be put in writing all the time, and it's a powerful tool. Ask questions and then listen to answers. Anybody ever ask your kid a question, or have your kid ask you a question and then not listen to what you said? Not, slightly frustrating. So, demand that people listen if they're asking you questions as well. Identify problems and propose solutions. A really powerful question to ask is, what do you want to have happen? So this is just a review of information we've already covered. You know your child better than anybody else does. Your deep knowledge and insight can also mean that you're not objective. That's true for any parent, and that's okay. In fact, that's good, right? You're the one saving your kid from the tiger. You got to be able to not be objective and look out for them above everybody else. But it's also important to know that that might mean sometimes that you don't have all the information that somebody else has that's also sitting with you at the table. Same for the person sitting at the table. I see educators be mama bears and papa bears about their classrooms and about the kids that they serve. Everybody's invested and emotionally invested, and that's really good. And we also have to use our skills to regulate our emotions as well. This one says, your best advocates are not those whose first goal is to do what you want them to. You want lawyers to do that, right? That's their job. But there are those who will fight for what they understand to be in the best interest of your child. Get support, bring advocates and friends with you, ask for consultation. This one says, great programming and problematic environment versus poor programming and a great environment. Right? You can have an awesome school and somebody who's not delivering things well or knowing your child well, or you can have a not great school and a teacher who knows your child well and have really different outcomes. So pay less attention to the numbers than the test scores and more attention to that relationship building with the people who are directly serving your child. Don't demand that your school psychologist or anybody be an expert on everything. Help and ask for help finding people who can fill the circles that you need. This last page is just information about my practice now. Brooks Powers Group is a group of clinicians, BCBAs, psychologists, therapists, former teachers, behavior technicians who provide different kinds of services. And we didn't have a table out there because we couldn't quite get it together to have a table out there, but we've worked in about 50 school districts in this area and really love being that bridge between educational and clinical worlds. So brookspowers.com is our website that's going to be updated this summer. School years are really tough times for us to do that. All right, so we have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions if people have questions. Yeah.
Yes.
Microphone.
Yes, what do you think about services for people with autism in Seattle? I mean, what do you think about the Seattle freeze and how people with autism aren't very adequately served in Seattle?
That's a great question. So how are people with autism, how do I feel about services for autism in Seattle? It's a good question, and it's a tough question, because when I think of it from the perspective of what's available right now and our needs being met, the answer is no, right? The answer is we have inadequate services. We have wait times that are way too long for accessing services, for accessing supports, for accessing diagnoses. We have inadequate coverage, even though we have some of the best coverage for compared to lots of other diagnoses for people with autism, and it's definitely not enough. So I'm thrilled that more and more resources keep popping up. I learned about a new one out there today. And I love it when I find that I have, that things are added that I didn't know about before, because it means that things are being added. So when I think about it from the perspective of, is there enough right now? No. When I think about it from the perspective of, is it better than it used to be? Yeah. It's a lot better than it used to be, but we have a long way to go. Does that answer your question? Yeah. What would you do if you could add something?
I would just maybe, like if there be like places where people could go to get for resources.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, is that Donna?
Yes.
Good. I was wondering about special education and its relationship with behavioral health with a child that has emotional behavior disturbance and has missed a lot of school, and that there doesn't seem to be a very effective approach to helping kids. Like I was told, going to school is her choice, but she was severely depressed. And so like, what are your thoughts about how to work with a child who needs a counselor, but they're saying it really belongs out in the world?
Right. Thank you. It's such a good question. And this is I think where I do a huge percentage of my work right now is kind of in this gray area where nobody quite knows what's the responsibility of the school district and what's the responsibility of the family, and really what's the responsibility of the community, right? So, for example, if you have a child who has mental health difficulties that are interfering with them getting to school, and they won't get out of bed, so that's in your house, to come to school. Used to be that the general practice was the school's responsibility starts the moment they cross the threshold to school, or maybe the school bus. But case law in our state changed that expectation a while ago. And so now there's a lot more gray area because there was a case, and I don't know which one it was, but I just got a little primer on this information from an educational attorney, that now it's considered, at least to some degree, the responsibility of the school district to participate in the process of providing supports and services and assessments to understand what's going on and intervene with situations of school refusal. Usually school refusal, difficulty with going to school, and mental health kinds of things start in kind of quiet ways, and it's like little roots are being put down that if we had gotten to do something with them 3 years ago, things would look really different than they do now. There are more and more resources being added to healthcare in the schools, health in general, but mental health as well. We are in a very tricky state, as many of you already know and have found out, and that our age of medical consent is 13. I think that law itself has resulted, it was a well-intentioned rule that was set, and it was set to protect people, but it ended up also really interfering with providing services, having access to services for 13-year-olds who, for mental health reasons, maybe aren't very well equipped to be making really good decisions about their mental health, or whether they should be going to school or staying at home on the switch, or that kind of thing. So there are more resources now, and we see very different responses in different districts about accessing that.
So the law about the age of consent is being amended this year, and it just reached concurrence, and it's going to the governor's office. And I've been working on it.
Thank you. 5706, is that?
No, well, that was the start. Now it's House Bill 1874, and it allows families to access treatment and parents to consent for outpatient services. So it's going to significantly help that, and then there's the law about school refusal, which is a totally different segment. And I don't think school districts know about that either.
Well, it's all about interpretation of that law, right?
Well, if you have an IEP plan, it's 28A something 225, I don't remember. Anyway, if you have an IEP plan, within the third day of your child missing school, within a month, they have to have an IEP meeting and they have to do a Warren's assessment.
Yeah.
Like that's not, there's no gray area there. Interpretation is you're either doing it or you're not doing
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So you have to know about it to ask for it because districts aren't using it.
And oftentimes you'll find employees of districts who have no idea that that's the law and don't know where to find the assessment tool that they should be using. Right? Yes.
You suggested that we demand the people who are serving our children to have some level of expertise. How would you go about making those types of demands without being, overly bearish?
Right. That's a great question. That's a tricky word, demand, right?
Right.
Because we can get our kids to do all kinds of things in different ways.
Specifically during an assessment time, where you have like a school psychologist and the administration trying to make decisions for your child that are going to last their lifetime. However, in my case in particular, I have a whole bunch of independent, people with lots and lots of letters after their name saying something very differently. How do I, let the school know that perhaps they're not the expert in this?
Well,
that
I think
kind of conversation. I can't even model it.
Can you get your experts to be willing to have direct conversations with people
They've
in your
written
school?
letters.
Yeah.
And they still would consider them.
Yeah, letters can be a little bit trickier too. It's a tricky thing. I think change often happens when people are looking other people in the eye and having conversations, and that's a really tricky one. It's tricky to get insurance coverage to cover your provider sitting down at a table with your child's school or that kind of thing. So that's
or even internally, where you have a child, the school psychologist seeing or not seeing something that perhaps the school occupational therapist should probably see.
Yeah, sometimes people disagree on teams. There are a number of legal avenues that you have, contacting the office of the superintendent, those kinds of things. And boy, I've just seen things work out really different ways. Sometimes there's a person who's gumming up the system and nothing is working, and parents who want to do everything they can to not make it adversarial and then end up having to go there because nothing else was getting things to work. And sometimes it's appropriate and okay to go there. You'll find people in the same room being frustrated about somebody else in that room. There's not always kind of agreement about what's right for a person there. So if you can't get to an agreement with the people in the room at one time, there are legal avenues for what to do and procedural avenues for what to do to get that support. But it's frustrating. Yeah, I'm sorry you're having that trouble.
Diagnosis, like, my son is autistic and they won't say he's autistic.
That sounds frustrating. I'm sorry.
You have here.
Yes. Oh,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Heather.
I'll do this
I'll
one first.
pretend this is a microphone, all
Okay.
right?
You'll be next. Okay.
Oh.
No, I messed up. Go ahead.
Okay.
Not me.
Is this presentation available to us?
Yes, it's being videotaped right now, so it will be posted
Does that,
in the future.
Are the slides then
Yes.
stealable?
Incorporated in it, yes.
Okay. And you said understood
Understood.org.
is kind of focused ADHD?
ADHD and learning disabilities, but it's got lots of IEP and special education advocacy information.
Do you recommend one that's more ASD-ish?
I find that different sites have different levels of good
Okay.
information, I guess I would say. Rights Law is a special education website, advocacy website that has been around for a long time. It's the last time I looked, at least, it still wasn't very pretty, but it has a lot of good information. And then the number of autism-specific, just general resources out there, it's huge. So, yeah.
Okay, and the last ask is, you said, I missed which way I should go. Go to school and ask that the teacher be expert in dysgraphia, dyscalculia, communication, that way, or demand that the teacher get trained in all of that? I mean, how is that different?
Yeah, no, don't ask that person become an expert in everything. Because first of all, you don't necessarily need that. You need experts to be weighing in and giving information, but you don't need them to be providing all of the support and all of the service all the time to the student. You just need to make sure that somebody's voice who does have expertise in there gets heard and gets to participate in training.
Is that clear to anybody else?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
We can talk more about it after.
Thank you.
As a segue to what has just been stated by both of these people, getting back to a more base level, from a teacher's perspective, what do you see happening within the university system or college system just to give a teacher in a regular classroom an idea of, hey, there is a problem here. Now who do I go to, or how can I help that child over this little blip? And sometimes it's just a little blip. But quite often that increases and causes more problems.
What starts as a blip can expand and snowball.
How would a teacher in a classroom get pre-preparation for that kind of a problem?
Well, when a child who has special needs is placed or in a school that has services and they're going to be in that classroom, I think it's really important to ask, and I've seen parents ask, that all students who will be serving their child have training, and that might mean that they do a summer half-day course on autism or something like that, but have training in autism. So you can ask for that as a related service in the IEP, which is a legal document. But I will also say that one of the things that I find that can be more powerful than general training, general disability training, is child-specific training. What works with this kid? And that training, that means sometimes the best training opportunities are happening in the classroom at the time when the blip is happening. And somebody who knows what to do when that happens is there to watch it, to understand it. Then they're there to try different strategies, and once they find what works, to teach the teacher about what to do when that happens. So that kind of training and consultation tends to be much more powerful. It's also more expensive, it's more time intensive, but the power that it has behind it, and the power it gives that teacher and other people to serve the next 200 kids that come along who might run into that same blip, is really remarkable. And that's that plan, that program that we were told couldn't be funded or couldn't be done because it would already have been done. And once people realize what you can get out of that in-depth training, I think it's powerful. Did that answer your question to some degree?
To an extent.
To an extent, yeah. All right.
So we're good time for one more.
Oh, well, we had two. I saw your hand up when I was talking. Sorry. And I'm happy to stay around afterwards to talk to folks too.
I was just going to add what has helped for me. I have a couple kids with special things going on, and my youngest, it's still, I found that the parent still has to be very much accountable. My youngest is on the SS 504 with the Marysville School District. And for some reason, I was still under the impression that once the paperwork was out there, that meant his teachers would all be in the know. They would know about my son. And I found shortly after this school year started that was very much not the case. That as a parent, I needed to request a meeting before school with all of his teachers and his counselor and the vice principal to let them know, to personalize it. This is the love of my life. This is how the love of my life behaves and responds to certain things. And this is why I think this is not working right now. And to show that my son and I will be accountable in this way. That may look like I'm going to get him to school as much as possible. I will have him available before school, after school. To help my son succeed, it would be great if you were accountable in these areas. And how does that look to you? Does that feel okay to you? And and like you referred to earlier, can we have paperwork on this meeting? Because at that point, when we're holding up our end of the bargain and being accountable, if my son's failing, which it was looking 8th grade, it's been rough. Then as a group here, we can all take a part in him being either failing or not failing. And the school has responded very well, but it's still very much a huge part on the side of the parent.
It's so much work. It's so much time and so much effort. But that joining and that connecting is powerful. And that saying, I'm sharing this with you. I'm not asking you to do it all, but you got to do your part.
Right.
It works when we all do our parts.
Maybe we'll take one more question and then we'll have to wrap up.
Thank you.
So you showed this slide that showed teachers and clinicians aren't meant to be balls. But where my wife and I are struggling with our autistic daughter is this working or not?
Yeah.
And there's what happens in school and with the BCBA therapist, and there's what happens at home, and we have no idea, right? So how do we balance that out between, is this working? Because we ask, and like, is she improving? And they're like, we don't know. How do we deal with that?
Well, your behavior folks at home should be collecting data that will tell you very quickly, or not at home, wherever your behavior services are being offered. That should tell you pretty quickly which direction things are happening. ABA is intended to be a very data-driven process. And then the legal requirement of goals written into IEPs are that they are measurable, and that there are specified intervals at which we assess to make sure that people are making progress towards those goals. And if the answer is ambiguous or the answer is no, then there's a problem. And either the goals are not okay, or the intervention that's supposed to be supporting somebody to get to the goals isn't okay.
And I think part of the problem is that they use language that we don't understand.
Yeah.
Like, what's a mand? I still don't know what a mand is.
Yeah.
So I guess my learning is we need to communicate more with them and demand that the IEP and goals be in language we can understand.
Yes. Yeah. It's a command or a demand minus the duh or the
Oh.
I mean, there's a BCBA that wants to disagree. I know lots of BCBAs who are like, yes, it's the language thing is ridiculous, but that's a big problematic piece. I mean, the education, the amount of time it took for me just to learn about and understand special education law, and that was part of my graduate programming. If I was doing that on top of parenting, and top of other demands, it wasn't part of what I was automatically already going to be doing anyway. It's incredibly overwhelming. And I think the amount of support that we provide to people in getting through that isn't sufficient. And a lot of that depends on relationship, a lot of it depends on numbers, a lot of it depends on laws. But the better of an advocate you can be, the more powerful, the more progress you'll make in getting things that look right for your kid. but I'm not going to tell you it's easy. And I will tell you, if you can get some respite and some self-care, it's really good.